What did you want to be when you grew up? Maybe you wanted to be a doctor or a dancer. Maybe you wanted to be the president. And at some point, you might have wanted to have been a superhero or a princess. Well, for Cait West, it didn't really matter what she wanted to be when she grew up, because in her fundamentalist Presbyterian household, her father had already decided her fate was to get married and to have children to the man of his choosing. This is a memoir of Christian fundamentalism, Christian patriarchy, and its unintended consequences. Before I begin, I do want to clarify Cait does say that most of the names in this, including her siblings, are changed. Cait West was born in the 1990s to parents who were already practicing Christians. She has an older brother, Kyle, an older sister, Allison, and a younger brother called Chris. In her earliest years, she remembers her family getting more and more involved with the church, but also getting more and more involved with patriarchy. They are friends of a very conservative family who recommended a magazine to them called Patriarchy. Now, this magazine was discontinued in 2004, but I want to give you a few quotes from it just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff Cait's father was getting into. A few of the quotes that Cait put in her book were, "Those, like the feminists who hate biblical patriarchy, hate God, whether they realize it or not, because God is the arch-patriarch, the archetype of fatherhood. You have a little kingdom called the family over which you can take dominion today." The magazine also sold things like chastening instruments, flexible like biblical rod, but also unbreakable, compact, attractive, and guaranteed, so that way you could spank your kids with something. And while it claimed to promote leadership in men, I personally feel like it was doing much more than that. It was promoting a society where women were subservient to men, and men had complete and total control over their families well into their children reaching adulthood. She says that after her father started reading it, there were changes, and he changed some of the policies for her older sister about dating. For example, her older sister Allison was going to be allowed to date at 18, but after reading this magazine, he told her that dating would not be allowed, only strictly monitored courtship. And for those of you who are wondering what exactly is courtship, we'll get into that later. Cait also said that the magazine reaffirmed her father's beliefs, that he was the normal one and the world was evil. His desire to control and micromanage his family wasn't what was wrong. It was other people who would criticize him that were actually in the wrong. And as she talks about this magazine, she mentions a dangerous theme that can be seen throughout the entire book, and I feel like a lot in Christian fundamentalism in general. The magazine promised that we would stay on the path to godliness if our parents followed the rules. And so it begins. Parents, husbands, teachers, pastors, enforcing draconian and strict laws, all in the desire to control people because they believe that that control will lead their subservience to holiness. While the magazine did bring a lot of changes, there was something else that brought some changes into Cait's life. Her father attended a Vision Forum conference. Now, Vision Forum, which is not particularly popular today, was another fundamentalist Christian movement that really pressed for the idea of patriarchy, as well as what is called the stay-at-home daughter movement. Now, a lot of you might know what a stay-at-home mom is, a woman who decides to stay home and raise her children rather than getting a job, which a lot of people, I feel like, would say is fine if that's what a woman wants to do and her husband respects her and gives her freedom and it isn't this unequal relationship. Stay-at-home daughter movement, though, teaches that girls should stay home after they become adults. They should not get real jobs or go to college, and that their husbands should be handpicked for them by their fathers through a very rigorous courting process, which is arguably more stringent than even those back in the day. She remembers Allison at one point wanting to elope with a boy that she worked with, but changing her mind because she knew she'd be cut off from her family, and then her father saying that it was a mistake to let his daughter get a job at all. She said after that her sister did nothing but stay home and sew. So after all of this introduction to more fundamentalist and patriarchal views through the Patriarchy magazine, the Vision Forum conference, they start attending the church of Kevin Swanson, who I did not know about before this book. From what I understand, is actually quite famous for his anti-LGBTQ teachings, and I'm not talking something like he believes being gay is a sin. He's along the lines of like Steven Anderson, gay people should be put to death, kind of crazy. Cait also references in this book that he said it was okay to spank children to the point of bruising them, and that wives should not have jobs. So this is the church that they start attending, and during all this as the years pass, Cait has a childhood that I actually end up relating to a lot. I did not grow up Presbyterian, I grew up Fundamental Baptist. So even though we had a lot of doctrinal differences, though, there were a lot of things that happened in Cait's life that I personally also experienced or had a very parallel experience to. She was homeschooled. She was bullied by kids outside of the church for being a goody two-shoes religious girl. She embraces this bullying as persecution, as she is told by her family that that's what she should do. She has a lot of religious OCD where she prays the same prayers over and over again, feels constant fear that she will not be good enough and that she's going to go to hell. Her communion reminded me so much of what I would go through, where she would be sitting there as the bread and wine was passed to her and just beg over and over again, please forgive me, please forgive me, please forgive me. And then she would eventually just, as she put it, decide she was going to take her chances. And a lot of that was all stuff I went through. And no one knew how to help her, because mental health isn't really a thing of fundamentalism. And while my family did not ascribe to the patriarchy like her family did, the churches we went to and the books I read and the events we attended did. And we heard things that, though they weren't as extreme as what she heard, the underlying principle is the same. Men serve God, women serve men. Your sole existence is to get married to a man, help him, and raise his kids. Outside of this, you're a feminist and you're a disappointment. Again, my parents did not believe this or teach this to me, but we still attended churches, and I was surrounded by a culture that taught that. And so I think it's interesting to see that even though we were technically different denominations, the fundamentalism was the same, and we both had very similar childhoods. A major difference, though, is that when I decided to not follow patriarchy and to get a job and go to college and be independent, my father supported me. Hers did not. In many ways, if you want to look at there being an antagonist to her story, you could point to her father. Now, while attending this church, they go to a church conference, and I think this really paints a picture of the kind of church it was. While they were there, the men attended the meetings, and she was the only woman in the room. And she was shocked, wondering, where are all the women? Like, did just none of them show up? And then she goes downstairs to the church kitchen, and that's where they all are. They're all cooking. Women are not allowed to vote in the meetings. Their main purpose there is simply to provide food for the men and to serve them. At lunch, a man quizzes her on theology, and when he's satisfied with her answers, he says she will one day be a good wife. And she makes such a good statement that I believe sums up Christian patriarchy and sexism. I was being recognized for my knowledge, but also reminded that I would only be allowed to use my mind to serve my future husband. So true. It's not, you're so well versed in theology. That's wonderful. It's, wow, you're so well versed in theology. You're going to be a great wife someday. Eventually her family moves to Hawaii and she reaches an age where she can start courting or looking for a husband. Again, this is not like dating. Whoever she courts, she cannot be alone with them. Her father has to approve them. And the mindset is not about having fun. You're supposed to be preparing to get married. So if you get emotionally attached to them at all, let alone have any physical contact such as hand holding, it's considered really heinous. Anyway, she becomes really desperate to start courting somebody. And this is important because in fundamentalism for a woman, life does not begin until you're married. You exist to serve a man and have kids. How can you do that without a husband? Her father says that for now, she exists to serve her head, which is him, her father, and she stays home all day doing housework, and he eventually allows her to get some little part-time gigs, babysitting and teaching piano, even though they aren't things she particularly enjoys. And she talks about waiting, just feeling waiting all the time. And she also mentions something which I know is true because a lot of people I went to church with believe this. In the Christian patriarchy, you are not an adult until you get married. This was something, again, my old pastor believed, and my father did not. And one time my father actually confronted him about this, and our pastor was shocked that my father did not expect me to completely obey him well into adulthood. In Cait's story, two men do end up coming along. The first one is just a friend, but our father shuts it down because he's Baptist. And though they have extremely similar beliefs, Baptist, as that is what I grew up in, don't believe in infant baptism. So her father is like, absolutely not. Second, she starts courting a man named Will. Cait says she eventually came around to truly love him, but in her world, it wasn't enough to be, as I mentioned earlier, physically pure. In Christianity in general, we believe in abstaining from premarital sex, and most Christians will agree that it's a good way to stay away from physical touch in general when you're dating somebody, because that is something the Bible recommends. But Cait's family, as I mentioned earlier, believed you needed to be emotionally pure too, which meant if Cait felt any affection for Will, her father would. Her feeling any attraction to Will or liking him at all was considered emotional adultery because they weren't married yet. She felt so baffled. She was like, how am I going to decide if I like him or not if I'm not allowed to even feel anything for him? What's wild is these emotions were emotions that came from heavily chaperoned outings in public or her home. And what's wild is half of these dates were her father literally just printing out a giant list of questions and quizzing them both. Like, what do you think of birth control? Have you ever viewed pornography? What are your views on child rearing? She said it was so awkward and stilted, and it was hard to form any emotional connection during a date like that. But still, she was led to have emotional impurities, and because of this, and Will in his mind also wasn't rich enough or masculine enough, he forced them to break it off. In some ways, she wonders if it was for the better, because it turns out Will was gay. And though Cait would not know this for years later, he was suffering through his own hell. But regardless of whether it was good things were broken off or not, is not really the point. The point would soon become she felt like her father was not content with any man who showed any interest in her. After this, their pastor's son David enters her life. After the events with Will, Cait feels manipulated, and she feels so upset at her parents, so she starts sneaking alcohol when her parents go to sleep, and she actually writes out a plan on how she's going to run away. Even though at this point she's in her early 20s, she's honestly being monitored to the point where you would think she's 15 years old. David and her are initially attracted to each other, but her father doesn't approve. He briefly does allow the courtship, but almost immediately takes it back, saying that until he has a degree and a full-time job or $40,000 in savings, he won't even consider her courting somebody. She believes her father's being ridiculous and has no intention of ever letting them marry. They therefore start hanging out as friends, but it develops into a real bond. All hell breaks loose when her dad sees them kissing in David's car. He yells at her again, saying she's nothing but a sinner, but honestly, she's at a point where she just does not care. She continues to meet with David, and they don't honestly do anything that any normal Christian would consider simple. They don't sleep together, they don't really touch each other that much. They're just having a normal dating relationship. Her father, though, is furious because he's not 100% involved in monitoring this relationship and does not 100% approve of it. Eventually, David decides to go to Michigan and start working so he can save up for them to get married, and Cait ends up joining him, and that's just what they do. Her father and her, up to this, though, just fight a ton, with him verbally berating her. She prints out a page about emotional abuse and leaves it on his desk, and it goes about as well as I think you would expect it to. He tells her that because he does not approve of this, he will not bless their marriage, and he's not going to walk her down the aisle to her wedding, which really devastates her. And the next day, he goes up to her and tells her, oh, actually, never mind, I am going to walk you down the aisle. And she says this entire experience about the aisle thing is really actually traumatizing for her, and ends up staying with her and revisiting her years later. What I think is the most ludicrous of all, though, is that her father, who is so against this relationship, to the church, is acting like he's totally okay with it and throws her an engagement party before she goes to Michigan. The hypocrisy of fundamentalism is on full display here, where there's a lot of fighting and issues in the home, but we're just going to pretend everything is great because we don't want people in the church to, think there's a problem. Anyway, after Cait joins David, they end up getting married, and her life does begin as she anticipated, though not in the way I think her father would have expected or wanted. She goes on birth control, gets a job, goes to college, all things that are strongly discouraged in her upbringing. They start out poor, but through hard work they're able to afford things they want and even end up going to therapy. Cait says that they do see her family about twice, and it's extremely stressful and intense both times, so there are no major outbursts. And something I think is amazing is that through all of this, her husband is extremely supportive. Though he also grew up conservative Christian, he did not grow up with the same patriarchal mindset, and remembers at times talking to her and hearing about the beliefs her family had about women not being allowed to work or go to college, and just being like, why though? So I just think it's really sweet and wonderful that he's there for her every step of the way, because not all women who leave this kind of fundamentalism get that. And as Cait gets better, she starts writing for school and even gets some of her articles published about her childhood, all names being changed for privacy. But things come to a head though, because her father ends up discovering that she has a Twitter, and that on her Twitter she made a post about how she doesn't send her father a Father's Day card, and why, because of how she grew up. And he is not thrilled. And he sends her all these long texts about how she never expressed how unhappy she was. How was he supposed to know? And how he loves her, and all the while refusing any accountability for anything he did. No, I'm sorry's or anything like that. And in response, she writes a long email that honestly slayed. She says, I love you, I respect you, I forgive you, but if we're going to have a relationship, we need to be able to be honest with each other. And if he's unwilling to accept any wrongdoing, she can't move forward in a relationship with him. She says she feels she has the right, as does he, to talk about her experiences growing up with compassion. from her perspective. He never ends up responding. The only time, from what I understand, they see each other after that is at a funeral a while later. And he goes in for a hug and she refuses it. And they have a brief exchange. They haven't really talked since. And it's sad, but at the same time, because it's true, if you are going to have a relationship with someone, you have to have boundaries. There has to be mutual acknowledgement. And it doesn't mean you don't love them or don't forgive them. But how can you have a relationship with someone who isn't willing to respect you at all? In the modern day, she does continue to write. She says that, unfortunately, she can't go back to church. There's just so much trauma associated with certain things. And she says things that comfort other people and bring them peace just give her a really bad feeling inside. And something else that she struggles with a lot is people will tell her, well, what you went through isn't real Christianity. Or they'll just be like, well, I'm a Christian and I never went through that. And even if that is true, it does not comfort her at all to have people telling her that. I'm still a Christian and I can relate to an extent because I cannot go back to a Baptist church. I don't think all Baptists are bad people, but last time I tried to go to a Baptist church, I nearly passed out because it was just so stressful being there and being reminded about what it was like growing up in that kind of an environment. So I'm not going to judge that. Her views on spirituality throughout the book are represented through fire. Fire plays a really big part in her life because their family car ends up catching on fire and her family has to evacuate because there's a fire in Colorado. She does a really good job then of comparing her spiritual life to fire. She says how fire is something that she used to find warmth and comfort in, and is something that can be so good, but now, because of experiences, it frightens her. It's something that she wishes she could control, not something she wants to completely cut out of her life. And she points out how through the fire that has destroyed things, there will be ashes that can be used to fertilize new growth. And the comparisons are just really well done and put so well. Besides religious stuff, she has spent a lot of time reevaluating her education, political views. She acknowledges that being homeschooled, the Christian curriculums they use often brushed over American tragedies. I will say from personal experiences, I was homeschooled about a decade after her, that things have changed for the better. And we've gotten better at addressing things like the Trail of Tears and the effects of slavery, but there is still definitely work that needs to be done. She works a lot with Native American tribes now, and even attended a ceremony where a treaty of peace was signed. And she just hopes this book will help people. I will say there's something so powerful about reading a story of someone who has been through really similar pains as you. Even though I did have the support of my father, the patriarchal churches we grew up in, and the feelings she went through were so similar. And it was honestly so comforting to read about somebody who'd been through similar experiences. And we grew up at different time periods, different parts of the U.S., even different denominations, but there are really big similarities. It just validates that no, you're not crazy. No, you're not a bad person. There's a genuine issue and it needs to be addressed. Do I recommend this book? Absolutely. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think that if you've been through this kind of upbringing, you should absolutely read it. But even if you haven't, I think if you're trying to understand where certain people are coming from when they're talking about Christian patriarchy, this is what you should read. It's not about, oh, the Bible's evil, religion is bad, but it's about a very certain interpretation of the Bible that is twisted to control people and has nothing to actually do with what Scripture says. As always, thank you for checking out this channel. Let me know in the comments if there are any other books you'd like me to read. Make sure to like and subscribe. Have a great rest of your day. Bye!